I hello. Not sure whether I'm audible right now. So, all right. So just sort of wave if I am audible clearly, so that I can start. All right. Yeah, or just let me know in the. All right. So I am audible. I'm assuming. So I had some bit of trouble. I had to restart my phone. I had to restart Bluetooth, and do the equivalent of formatting Windows and reinstalling everything to get this setup to work. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, all right, depending on where you are. And this is the first of the Masala Lab Q&A sessions that we'll do on common questions that many of you have, right? And this is, all of you sent me lots of questions. Thank you very much. And I said, look, please avoid sending me questions on diet and nutrition, and all of you sent me questions on diet and nutrition. So what I will do is ignore all of those questions, and what I do next week is get an actual clinical nutritionist and get all of those diet and nutrition questions answered. So in this one, I'm only going to take the questions that are focused on food and flavor and cooking per se, not so much the health aspect. While if there's any outrageous misinformation that I think that I can clear up right away, I will do that. All right. So so the first of the series, I'm going to call it hydrogen, because again, element number one, and so the next session will be called helium. Right. So hopefully we'll have a lot of noble gas in that. So anyway, on that note, I am going to start. I'll try and do as much as possible within the hour. I believe lives work for an hour, and then anything left over, we will continue in next week. Right? Again, I've spent the last 2 years essentially working remotely and doing these kinds of Zoom sessions. But one difference is that I usually see the other people, and this is a first in the sense that I'm only looking at myself. And so this is a slightly odd feeling in that sense. I'm used to looking at people in an audience or in a room or over Zoom. So, all right. So I'm literally going to go through the questions as I have largely skipped the questions that are either too basic and require an elaborate answer, which again, especially if it's available in my book, I'm just going to say, well, you know what, I think you should just read my book. So I might skip some of those very general questions. I might skip questions that I was not able to understand. And if I'm able to get through the questions you've already asked, if you guys have any further clarifications that we have time left over, by all means, you can ask me any further questions as well, right? So I'm going to start off with questions on pressure cooking that I got from about 4 people. So Insta-Niti asks, what's the right way to cook pulses, especially not in the pressure cooker? Well, Insta-Niti, I don't know why you would not cook pulses in the pressure cooker. They're very convenient. Pulses are harder to cook. They have a lot of resistant starch and pectin that requires them to be soaked, especially the bigger ones like chana and rajma. That require them to be soaked and take a lot of time to cook in an open pot. Pressure cooking actually just makes cooking a lot faster. That said, if you do want to cook it on an open pot, just soak it as long as you can, discard the soaking water, and cook it on an open pot with lots of water. Don't use very high temperature, because that's going to harden the seed and it takes a longer time to cook. So you want to cook at a slightly lower temperature for a longer amount of time. So I think so that's something that you can do. The second thing you do is that you make sure that you're not boiling it along with or cooking it along with any acidic ingredients like tomatoes, amchur, and so on, because again, acids harden the skins of plant material. Bases, on the other hand, like baking soda, actually loosen pectin and make it easier and softer to cook. So the other hack obviously is that you could add a tiny pinch of baking soda if you are cooking it in an open pot to make the process go faster. Honestly speaking, I can see that there is a difference in textural quality when you cook rice in a pressure cooker versus rice in an open pot. The open pot rice is almost always better, especially for pulaus and biryanis and such. But for dal, I've honestly seen no difference at all. So I think you should just go ahead and use a pressure cooker. So Shri Shri Shri. So one more Shri than the famous Shri from Bangalore. Is pressure cooking unique to India? It's a good question. So pressure cooking was invented by Denis Papin, who's a French inventor, and it's been used in Europe for a long time, particularly to cook harder cuts of meat, the poorer, the cheaper cuts of meat, red meat that take a longer time to cook, and so on. But part of the reason why they became super popular once the British introduced them to India is again because of the historical cost of cooking fuel. And again, Indians being frugal have always found sought out methods that save money in the kitchen. And a pressure cooker is one of the easiest ways to save on cooking costs. And if you go by the amount of cost that an LPG cylinder costs today, using a pressure cooker more is actually a good thing, because it will give you the same cooking effect with about 30 or 40% less fuel, because you're cooking at higher pressure, and at higher pressures the boiling point of water is higher, so water still remains liquid that allows you to cook at a significantly higher temperature. So this is why pressure cooking is popular in India, because it is a time-saving thing for the most part. The second interesting thing, pressure cookers are more popular in the south than they are in the north. And although the gap is now closing, but again, obviously has to do with the fact that the south and east are more rice-based, and there's more of a need to do that. But you'll also find that it also is correlated with how early women had access to education and jobs. And the earlier they had access to those, pressure cookers became more and more popular amongst working professionals. And so therefore, it's obvious that more women were working and still continue to do so in the south, so pressure cookers are a lot more popular, simply as a convenience thing. The third interesting aspect is that the variety of rice that you often cook in the south and the east is the low amylose variety, which is slightly more sticky. And so the kinds of dishes we have, the steamed rice separately and the side dishes separately, well, they tend to go along with the variety of rice that is more common in the south and the east. Basmati rice, which tends to be more high amylose, is not suitable for pressure cooker cooking, because you don't get the right texture for the most part. It does not matter as much with rice that is high on amylopectin. So that's another reason why it's more common in this part of the world. And I think another part of the question was why, often if you see something like a MasterChef, people struggle to figure out how to cook rice on an open pot, whereas Indians just seem to use a pressure cooker. And so on. This again comes with the fact that the rice is a novelty in the West. And so every time it's a fine dining novelty, people tend to gravitate towards not convenience, but the quote unquote right way to cook it. And therefore the open pot method, which can be tricky for beginners, is what they end up struggling with on those programs. Whereas, the Chinese or the Japanese or, Indians, for instance, will choose a rice cooker or a pressure cooker. In fact, the Japanese style rice cookers actually produce really good quality rice, cooked rice, than what you might get from a pressure cooker in India. So, if you're really up for it, you might want to get some of those Zoji Rushi type devices that bake absolutely, pitch perfect rice in that sense. Okay. All right. So, Chitta Spandini asked me a borderline controversial question about what is your take on one pot, one shot cooking. I know one pot, one shot is sort of like a popular sort of internet cult for a while. And I think it's a fantastic way to save time. Obviously, if you're working and you still want to make the effort to eat at home, I think being able to put everything in the pressure cooker and cooking it in one shot is a fantastic technique. And I think that method has also introduced a lot of shortcuts, like the ability to pre-make tadkas and then add them and so on. So this is indeed it's a time-saving technique. But what I would say is that trying to use it for everything every time is I think a slightly pointless goal. You cannot get a lot of interesting textures if you basically blast everything you have in a pressure cooker. It's ideal for certain kinds of dishes, the khichdi type dishes, the sambar type dishes. It is even ideal for highly watery vegetables like beans and certain things, which you can actually, by the way, retain its bright green color better if you actually use a pressure cooker with very little water, right? And you're less likely to leach nutrients. And there are those kinds of small advantages, but if time saving is the goal, efficiency is the goal, by all means, I think it's a fantastic technique. But if you want to make the best out of a wide range of dishes, then I think you have to look outside one pot, one shot. Okay. And I think, all right, so Krishna23045, well, rightly so, asks, they say pressure cooker reduces nutrients. Is it true? I'll make an exception simply because this loss of nutrients business people have to first realize. All cooking is loss of nutrients, okay, in most situations. And again, it's tricky. Something like a carrot or a tomato gives you more nutrients when it's cooked than when it's raw. Right? So it's not always true either, right? But in general, heat and acids and any kind of cooking technique is going to reduce some amount of the nutrients. You're either going to leach it in the water, you're either going to destroy it with heat, so on and so forth, right? But at the same time, if you don't cook stuff, you can't eat many things either. Right? So you can't eat a dal raw. You can't eat many vegetables raw. So that said, ultimately the goal should not be to try and maximize nutrition from every single ingredient, but see overall if you're actually getting. So in that sense, the loss of nutrients in any single cooking technique is really not much, right? Short of deep frying and burning something, where you can reasonably clear that yes, you're going to lose some of the more delicate stuff. But then again, fried stuff is delicious. So you might want to do that in moderation and so on. So that said, pressure cooker, does it reduce nutrients? Not really. I think you can. It can be a part of your arsenal of cooking techniques. Okay. Thomas George 3015 asked me, what is the most underrated food city in India? I want to preface a little bit of my idea or philosophy around this idea of underrating or overrating. Okay. Before I actually answer the question. So I still want to answer the question because it'd be silly if I just give you gyan and not answer the question. So whole idea of underrating and overrating by itself is, well, overrated, if you will. Because what happens is that food experiences are deeply personal and they are subject to nostalgia. Okay? So what you might find underrated is simply a case of you appreciating the novelty or the comfortness of that city's food while somebody else is not able to. And you're like wondering why they're not able to. And I think that's a silly exercise, right? So that's it. But to be honest, everyone is quite likely to either underrate or overrate something based on their personal experience. It's just the way it is, right? Somebody who grew up in a very strictly vegetarian or vegan kind of environment is less likely to find, say, the diversity of, say, Kolkata's cuisine interesting enough. Because the amount of interesting things you can get on the vegetarian side will be a smaller set. Still, you can get lots of fantastic vegetarian food, no doubt. But in sheer terms of diversity, the Indo-Chinese Tangra cooking, the Bengali food, the Mughlai food, and the Avdi food, and so on, you're far more likely to appreciate it if you have a wider palate and so on. So in that sense, so it doesn't make sense for somebody to say, oh, Calcutta is underrated, to somebody who cannot necessarily enjoy the food of that city, right? So for me personally, if you just simply ask me, I would simply go with the kinds of cities that don't tend to be in the typical average person's mindset, especially if you're not from that place. So the 4 cities I would encourage people who have not experienced it so far is Madurai, Indore, Kozhikode, and Nagpur. I think these cities have really, really great food. And I won't get into details of what dishes, we could do a separate session, but I think you should definitely go after, should try the food in Madurai, Indore, Kozhikode, and Nagpur. I would actually say if you're a meat eater, Madurai and Kozhikode, are the places. If you're a vegetarian, Indore and Nagpur are fantastic places. And again, within Nagpur as well, if you eat meat, I think the Saoji style of cooking, especially if you like spicy food, I think it's absolutely fantastic, right? And so on. Okay. So Noek Binge asks, how do you pick and choose vendors for groceries? Okay, I'm going to go slightly faster so that I can cover as much as possible. So it's very simple. try and find out where your vegetables come from. I generally avoid supermarkets as much as possible. Go to more local sellers. Try and find out where he's buying it from. If he's buying it in the usual big wholesale market, then it's all coming from the same places. Try and find people who don't sell all vegetables but only sell a few vegetables, because they specifically source them from farms that are nearby the city. I think that would actually give you a good way to select vegetables. And last but not the least, when you go select vegetables, select ugly vegetables. Don't select the good looking ones. And again, don't buy large amounts, buy small amounts and use them up quickly. Ugly vegetables are far more likely to be delicious because ugly shape, a lot of scars and so on. Those vegetables are likely to have been attacked by pests. The plant is likely to have been attacked by pests, and thus the plant will produce more flavor. Flavor essentially is all of the chemical warfare that the plant indulges in. So therefore, I think you should buy ugly vegetables from small sellers who don't sell everything but source stuff from a nearby farm, especially if you're in a city. This is how I pick places to buy vegetables. All right. Daydreamer After Dark wants to know soup thickeners other than corn flour, or can rice water be used as a thickener for soups? Absolutely yes. Rice water will indeed thicken soups as well. But I want to tell you something. Corn starch, rice flour, again rice starch, wheat starch, maida or atta, as well as potato starch. Effectively, chemically speaking, they are all largely very similar. They all contain the same two starches, amylose and amylopectin, maybe in slightly differing ratios. And so, for some reason, people seem to believe that there is something bad about cornstarch. Yes, in general, you should reduce the use of processed starches. But if you're using 1 teaspoon or a tablespoon to thicken something, the amount is so small that you shouldn't be worried about whether you're using potato starch or rice flour. They're all roughly the same, to be honest. Right? Harshad Mukashi wants to know, rice in the microwave cooks perfectly in 15 minutes every time I do it, but is there any disadvantage of doing this? Absolutely not. Microwave is in fact one of the best ways to cook many things whenever you can cook something in the microwave. The only pitfall sometimes is that you have to cook smaller amounts of rice, because it may be harder to cook larger amounts of rice. You'll have a few uncooked spots, low heat spots within the microwave. But otherwise, I think it's one of the most convenient and clean ways, especially if you don't have to wash a pressure cooker afterwards. I think it's a fantastic way to cook rice as well. Vin Dyer wants to know if Kala Jeera, Kalonji, Nigella and Shahi Jeera, are they all the same? What's the confusion? The first three are the same. Kala Jeera, Kalonji and Nigella are the same thing. Nigella sativa is the black seed that is used as part of Panchforan in Bengal. It has a fantastically strong, mildly onion-like flavor. That's why sometimes it's called onion seeds. Shahi Jeera is different. It's different from the regular cumin. It's slightly smaller, and it has a very similar but slightly more complex flavor than regular cumin. Right. So often used in at least in Hyderabad biryanis and so on. Okay. Ajina Box asks, why does old dosa batter not make crispy dosas? So the reason old batter does not make crispy dosas is that there is simply more aeration, more fermentation, so more carbon dioxide trapped within the batter. And number two, the microbes keep eating the starches, right? So therefore, there is less and less sugar left. And for you to actually get crisping and browning, you do need sugars and proteins, and you need enough of them. And so as the batter tends to keep getting more and more fermented, there are less and less sugars in the batter. Your dosa will look more and more white, if you notice. That's why your kal dosa tends to be pretty much white in color with a few spots of darkening, because the browner colors come from caramelization of sugars and the Maillard reaction between sugars and proteins. And the more the fermentation, the less amount of sugar there is actually going to be. Right? So that's why old dosa batter does not make crispy dosas. K. Bistri wants to know, why do people say do not mix fruit and milk? This is this long list of your Ayurvedic, one must not mix fish and dairy, one must not mix fruit and milk. I have a very general sort of broad rule for thinking about these kinds of things, right? Always remember that in general it may be arrogant to dismiss knowledge of the past. At the end of the day, we are alive because the people with cooking and medicine knowledge of the past kept us alive, right? So in that sense, some of that traditional wisdom clearly will still be applicable. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, did they have refrigerators? Did they have freezers? Did they have electricity? Did they have preservatives? Did they have modern genetically modified crops? Did they have microscopes to understand that rotting and spoilage happens as a result of bacteria, yeast, and other fungi and so on? That's all very modern knowledge, right? So you always have to take traditional knowledge and see if modern knowledge proves it or says, you know what, those were under different conditions. It made sense back then, it doesn't make sense, right? So a lot of these combination things largely have to do with people not taking risks at a time when food is literally a life or death matter. So any dish you make is spoiling from when you cook it, and you better eat it within few hours, or it's going to be dangerously poisonous. Okay? And so therefore, a lot of the traditional ideas of what to combine, what to cook, etc., all relied on heuristics that generally tended to use more acidic ingredients, so that, acidic ingredients extend the shelf life. Onion and garlic extend shelf life. Spices extend shelf life, and so on, right? And likewise, certain combinations like fish and dairy, both fish and dairy are notoriously perishable, right? So they're literally spoiling. The fish is spoiling from the moment it's dead. And milk is spoiling from the moment it got out of the cow. So you want, in general, you don't want to try and combine these things at a time when you don't have refrigeration. But that's not true anymore, right? I mean, you have stubs, you have a tandoori oven, and Amritsari fish tikka is literally fish and dairy in that sense. And the third way to ask these questions is find out if somebody else in the world seems to be perfectly alive and not dying as a result of that combination. And if other people seem to be alive, then you might want to be skeptical of those kinds of things, right? I know it's a general heuristic, right? I've often found that when it comes to traditional wisdom, listen to old Indian women and completely don't listen to old Indian men. I think that's a reasonable, simple heuristic for everyone to follow if you want to be safe. Okay? All right. So the next one is Sarvesh Ketan wants to know, why does mint or coriander chutney go dark, go darker green? How to keep it bright and fresh? Okay. So why do green things go dark? This applies to palak paneer as it does to any kind of spinach, as it does to any kind of a green chutney of any kind, right? The reason is that the green in anything you eat comes from one molecule called chlorophyll. Right? All of us learned about it in school. That's what gives plants the green color, right? What happens is that when the plant dies, meaning that when it's cut, when you're chopping, when you're heating, when you're cooking, so the plant cells break. Remember that animals are dead when the animal was killed. Plants are alive till you cook them. Okay, so just so you know. So when you chop a spinach, when you crush it in the grinder, is when the plant is actually dying. Okay, so when the cells break, there are acids inside the cell, and those acids leak out. And part of what happens is that those acids displace the magnesium molecule in the chlorophyll, okay, and with something else. Okay, and that is not bright green. The one with magnesium is bright green. The one without magnesium is not bright green. So that's why they actually become that duller olive green color. So the second thing that happens is oxidation. So when cells break, plants also release this enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, which basically, it's like saying, well, now that you've killed me, I will ensure that I will make this, completely useless for you, and allow wholesale oxidation. So that's what makes it darker, right? Duller green, darker, right? So that's because of oxidation, because of this enzyme. So here's what you can do. To prevent the magnesium ion from being lost, you might want to avoid acidic ingredients. That's why when you squeeze the lime juice, always squeeze it right at the end. Don't squeeze it while you're actually grinding. Then your chutney is less likely to be that kind of bright green, right? The second thing is that the enzyme, you can use a very interesting trick. You can blanch the greens, even coriander, mint, palak, etc., briefly in boiling water for like 10 seconds. And that is enough to deactivate the enzyme, because high temperatures deactivate enzymes. And once enzymes are deactivated, well, then it won't, then when you actually grind it up, the oxidation will be a lot less and it will remain a lot more brighter green. But the blanching will also cause things like coriander and mint to lose a little bit of their flavor, but not much. But I think if you're making a large batch, it's always, good to try and blanch and so on, right? Okay. I can actually see that despite my caveat, people are still asking me nutrition questions. So I'm going to save all of the nutrition questions here and actually invite a nutritionist to answer them next week. Okay, right. So next question from Swetanshu lives to eat, as one must. What's the best ingredient to replace onion and garlic in a recipe without compromising on flavor? Swetanshu lives to eat. This is a question that ancient Indians asked almost 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And the answer they came up with was this very bizarre plant of the fennel family that grows only in the mountains of Afghanistan and Iran. And that plant is called asafoetida. And the reason Indians are the largest consumers of asafoetida is basically the rise of Buddhism and Jainism and essentially the arrival of stricter dietary rules and the biases against onion and garlic as being in some sense treated as tamasic or closer to meat and so on, essentially made asafoetida the replacement for onion and garlic when you do not eat onion and garlic. So, well, that's about the closest you can get. I would further add that in general, sulfur containing flavor molecules will give you taste similar to onion and garlic. And the two spices that have strongly sulfurous flavors are asafoetida and curry leaves. So use asafoetida and curry leaves, which by the way, most people who do not eat onion and garlic will use lots of that because it kind of gives you the same sulfurous flavors and so on, right? Okay, Swetanshu lives to eat also wants to know how to stop curd from curdling without any flour or cashews. So the reason curd yogurt breaks when you heat is because it's a weak emulsion. Emulsion is a mixture of, in this case, a mixture of fat and water, which otherwise don't mix, right? Mayonnaise again is fat and water, but it's kind of held together by something called an emulsifying agent. In mayonnaise, it's usually something like a mustard, which is a molecule that says, oh, here's one part of me that likes fat, one part of me that likes water, so I'm going to keep them all together. Okay. Curd, yogurt on the other hand, is a weak emulsion. And the moment you heat it, it actually breaks, right? So one way to strengthen the emulsion is to really whisk the curd hard. Okay. But that will only give you a little bit of extra strength, which is why you need to add some kind of starch binder like a besan, rice flour, and any other cornstarch and so on, so that the starch as it cooks will become a thick goo which then emulsifies, helps the emulsion stay strong and so on. So I don't see why you should not use a flour, but if you do not want to, then you either have to whisk it really hard and more importantly keep the temperature low and keep whisking the vessel and prevent it from splitting. It's too painful. So I think you should just use a little bit of besan. It's actually quite easy that way. All right, Aisha 8 wants to know, what's the science behind oil leaving masala to indicate that it is fried enough? Okay, so this oil leaving the sides is probably one of those phrases in Indian food blogs. If you search for that expression, literally every recipe will have it. It's a gospel that has been passed down from the past. So essentially, it's a very simple heuristic that is seeking to give you a visual insight about whether enough water has evaporated. So the idea is that as long as there is water in the essentially in that mix, like a tomato, onion, all of these things have water, right? As long as there's enough water, what's going to happen is that water is what you'll see. The oil droplets may be there in between, but you're not going to really see it much, right? As the water reduces, you're going to see the oil visibly more and the fat visibly more, and it's generally an indication that look, you're very close to all water being evaporated. Any more means you're going to burn, and any less means you still have more water. It's essentially a simple heuristic for that reason. That's all there is to it. Okay. Vishal Suri and Nutrition Reels actually want to know, why do so many leftover dishes taste better the next day? Okay. So this is particularly true for a certain category of dishes. Obviously not true for dishes with dairy, coconut, things that kind of go bad, rancid very quickly. So it's usually things that have strongly acidic ingredients, things like a fish curry, like a chicken curry, and so on. And this is also particularly more true for meat than it is for certain other dishes. What happens is that spices often take more time to release their oils into the fats. And so the longer something is staying, particularly if not at room temperature, because where bacteria will be another problem, especially if you keep it in the fridge where you don't have that problem, the spices have more time to release more of their essential oils into the fat, but particularly animal fat that might be there within the skin and so on. And so you get a more integrated sort of a flavor over time, as opposed to immediately after cooking, right? So that is why many dishes, particularly sour, meaty dishes, tend to improve with time up to a point. 12 hours, 16 hours, not more, right? Okay, so Yatharth Garg wants to know, should spices be added with onions or with tomatoes in a gravy dish? The answer is it depends. If you're using whole spices need to be added in the oil so that you get their flavors into the oil, right? After that, when you add powdered spices, is essentially a matter of preference. Okay, you can add them early if you're adding a lot, but you still want a slightly more muted integrated flavor. But if you want a stronger flavor and you don't want to use too many spices, then you want to add it right at the end. In fact, not at the beginning at all. You want to use your dhania powder and jeera powder and things like garam masala, right, kasuri methi and so on, right at the end. And rather than anywhere earlier in the cooking process, right? But then again, you can use it earlier as well. Things like turmeric and chilies generally added much ahead of time. You might want to add it right after the onions and so on. They don't really matter as much from a losing flavor standpoint, because one is mostly color, the other is mostly heat or color, and so on. Okay. Yatharth Garg, how to understand what spices go well with which dish and in what proportion? Don't overthink this. Just look at dishes from every part of India. Every part of India will have a combination of some standard spices and a standard combination of fat, right? So if it's mustard oil and panchforan, that you can make any Bengali dish with that. Coconut oil and curry leaves, garlic, jeera, cumin, and so on will get you something that tastes of Kerala food. So don't overthink this. But in general, so go with standard regional local combinations, because those are being tested for years, right? But that should not stop you from experimenting. But when you experiment, just one word of advice: go minimalist, right? Don't throw 20 spices and assume that it's going to taste good. It won't, right? So go for individual new combinations that you might want to try. Who knows? Maybe something will work. Remember that Indian cooking, unlike Western cooking, actually uses what's called non-intuitive complementary flavor pairing. Basically, flavors that have different molecules rather than share the same flavor molecules. So Western combinations, say steak and butter and so on, many of those standard combinations work where the molecules are actually shared, right? So it tends to accentuate a single kind of a flavor. Whereas in India, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, it's about complementary flavors. You want to have as many different flavor notes as possible, right? So that's the overarching philosophy. All right. Sangvi Zeal wants to know how to fix a dish where excess asafoetida or hing is added by mistake. My commiserations. There's nothing you can do. It's a very intense spice, and if you've overused it, you can add more water. But even if you can't do that, on a lighter note, I suggest what the Germans do. Indians are the only ones who eat asafoetida as a food. The Germans use it as a pesticide. So you can take your dish, put it in the garden, and maybe your plants will grow better, right? So that's what you can do. Okay. Priya Gyan wants to know, how do you figure out what order to put ingredients? Okay. So I mess up and burn some ingredients. Priya, we've all done that. Okay. So you're not the only one. And even now, sometimes, it's very easy, especially with new ingredients. It can happen very easily. General rule is you start with oil, and you want ingredients that are high water, high flavor. So high flavor meaning things like onion, garlic, tomatoes, and so on, right? You want those first. Okay. So in order of essentially, high flavor first, but also high water in that sense. Then you do obviously want to add ingredients that are low flavor, again high water kind of first, because things that are on low water will cook faster. So for example, garlic has much less water than onion. That's why onion first, garlic later, because garlic has less water. Right? And so that's the general sequence. But honestly speaking, if you watch 100 YouTube videos, you'll find people cooking it in various different orders. And at some level, it doesn't matter as much as we think it does. And in many cases, The best way to do it is the way that works for you, and you just like the taste of it, and that's it. There's no best way to make anything. Okay. AM 1711. Okay. All right. 1711 are you a giant tortoise by any chance? Because those are the only things born that far back. It'd be really cool if you were a giant tortoise. How does one properly bruno onion and tomato? Mine ends up burning or stays mushy. So I'm going to point you to the answer that I said ahead. When you can visibly see the oil separate, means that you've caused enough water to evaporate from the onion and tomato. So at that point of time, it's perfectly brunoed. Any more, you will burn. Any less means you still have water, right? Okay. Okay. All right. So Sriram NR, right? So loved your ginger bug tutorial. Thank you. How do you determine what all juices can be fermented? Very simple. All non-fibrous, fresh, sweet juices without preservatives. So meaning that if you don't want the mess of making fruit juices at home, go to a fruit shop and ask him to make a fruit juice, because he's going to filter out all the pulp and all the fibrous bits. And again, he's not going to add preservatives, right? You can't buy like a Tropicana or something and try to make to ferment it, because they will come with preservatives that are aimed at preventing precisely this. So, some scientists will lose their jobs in those companies if you're able to make ginger ale out of one of these commercial juices. Okay? So that's how you can do this out of any fruit juice and any combination of fruit juice. Remember another rule: the sweeter the juice, the faster the fermentation. The sourer the juice, the slower the fermentation, because acids slow down fermentation. Okay, so that's what you have to think of. Amit 49. I've heard from several people that food cooked in earthen pots tastes better. Is it really true? It's a tricky question. So a lot of the clearly, because it's not a metallic environment which does not react with your food, earthen pots obviously absorb some bit of your food, and over time the pot essentially will have a little bit of those flavor aromas of all the dishes that have been cooked in it, because it's very impossible to wash an earthen pot completely perfectly, because all those pores will contain those flavor things. The general idea is that they tend to impart some flavor. Good or bad is highly subjective, but for the most part people tend to have a nostalgic attachment with this idea of something cooked in an earthen pot. My guess is that most people will not be able to make out whether a particular dish was cooked in an earthen pot or not. But if they see it visibly being cooked in an earthen pot, it will taste better to you because of all of those nostalgia and all of those other effects and so on, right? All right. Let's see. Thought Aggregator wants to know my opinion about weekly meal prep. Is it safe to cook for a week and refrigerate? Absolutely yes. Go for it. I think you'll actually make much better, more tastier, and more combinations of food if you prep ahead. And you can mix and match rather than try to invent something from scratch every day. There's a very Indian mindset of saying, no, everything must be made from scratch. No, the refrigerator is your friend. By all means, you can prepare ahead. Be aware of things that are perishable versus things that are not perishable, and the power situation in your part of the world, where do you have continuous power, and so on. But other than that, I think 1 week should absolutely be doable. Okay. KR Gops wants to know, I've heard many people say that you cannot let rasam boil. Just switch off when you see bubbles. Again, so these are all heuristics that are meant to prevent you from over boiling spices. Okay? Because in a rasam, the interesting thing about a rasam is that this is one of those situations where the flavors are being dissolved into water as opposed to fat, right? And so therefore, the goal is not for it to assault you in a spicy sense, but it's just to be mild enough so that you can drink it, right? Although, given the amount of spices you add in rasam, the fact that it is still drinkable, if instead of water, if that was fat, that would be like a tadka, right? So therefore, what I would essentially say is that these are generally aimed at making sure that you are not over boiling the spices, and every person will have their own heuristic. It doesn't really matter as much as long as you're broadly aware that you're not overboiling and you're able to sense when the aromas are strong enough. I think you'll be fine. All right. Okay. Vikram Moniz wants to know freezing and defrosting. Vikram on ice. Okay. Vikram on ice wants to know freezing and defrosting. So, okay. some sort of nomenclatural determinism there. Freezing, defrosting messes up the human body like frostbite. How come food is different? And he says, apologies if it's a stupid question. Vikram, on ice, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are only arrogant teachers and arrogant explainers. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Okay. So you're absolutely right. So food does undergo something that we call freezer burn. So freezer burn, what essentially happens is that a freezer, despite the fact that it's surrounded with ice, is still a very dry environment. Okay. So, and in fact, any surface water will directly sublimate from ice to water vapor. So, and therefore, especially meat, etc., and many vegetables that have a lot of moisture will end up sort of getting that darker, blackened kind of this thing. And by the way, under those conditions, oxidation will happen as well, right? Inside a freezer. Okay, and so therefore, which is why you have to seal meat in a tight-fitting sort of a cling wrap. And you have to make sure that you put vegetables and other things in airtight containers. Otherwise, you will get freezer burn, right? And remember that water in solid form occupies more volume than water in liquid form. This is unique for water, right? It's a unique thing in the universe. Okay? And part of the reason why we're all alive is the fact that water has that property. Okay, and that liquid water is actually denser than solid ice. Right? Now, because we are all mostly water and cells are mostly water, when water expands, it's going to break these cells, right? And so that's why once you take something out of a freezer, you better use it up fast. You can't have it sit around at room temperature, then it will rot very quickly. So that way, I think it's great that you can actually get things like carrots and peas that are super fresh in a freezer because they've been frozen a few hours after they were harvested. But if you let them sit at room temperature, they will wilt and rot in no time. Okay? So you want to cook them right away. So I think that's why I think it's a great question about. So absolutely yes, freezer burn or the plant equivalent or of frostbite does indeed happen. Yes. Anita Dhanashekaran wants to know what are veggies that should never be mixed in a recipe. Simple answer: no such rules. You can mix anything. Okay. Again, the choices should be based on if you're cooking something that takes a long time to cook, like say potato, and something that takes a lesser time to cook, like cabbage. You want to add the potato first and then add the cabbage, but there are no rules on mixing. You can mix anything you want, actually. All right. Mansi Prasad again asks a very interesting question that I thought I particularly must take. How is it that boiling oil is bad, right? Overheating oil, right? So especially when you deep fry vegetable oils and so on, they'll say that free radicals are created and the oils oxidize, and that's bad for you. But I can still safely heat butter into ghee, and that seems to be perfectly fine. So yeah, it's a great question because vegetable oils are liquid because they are unsaturated, right? So they have carbon-carbon double bonds, and so they are unsaturated. So those molecules are bent, so they don't get packed nicely with each other. So plant oils generally tend to be liquid. Okay, and these oils are far more likely to oxidize at high temperatures than the saturated fat of butter and ghee, right? And so that is why reusing fried oil beyond a certain number of times will give you all these funny rancid tastes and so on. On the other hand, I think ghee is not a problem. Okay, butter, ghee, and so on, not a problem. All right. Okay. So, all right. Spicy Busings wants to know: yogurt sets well in 8 hours, but it's not sour enough. If I keep it longer, it turns bitter and sticky. Spicy Busings, I recommend you do what every manager should do, is to please call all of the bacteria for a team meeting and fire them. Right. So clearly, I think your bacterial culture is simply not healthy enough. I would suggest get another culture from someone, get another piece of yogurt from somewhere else, a yogurt whose taste you like. Often, I don't know if you're not in India, chances are that the yogurt that you buy from a store will not have living cultures. So you might actually want to make sure that it says probiotic and it has living cultures, and then use that or borrow from a neighbor, and so on. Right. And then retry this. So clearly, I think it's your bacteria are underperforming. So this is the time of the year you give them a bad appraisal rating, fire them and hire new people. All right. So Margot Ruth Spiegelman, can we make tomato sauce using the same procedure as hot sauce? No. Tomato sauce is thicker, concentrated, and involves long periods of cooking. Sun drying and cooking and other that require industrial machinery. So it's a lot of effort to try and make a tomato sauce at home. Not really worth it. A hot sauce, on the other hand, has a much waterier texture. So I think it's easier to make. Okay. Okay. I'm going to try and take a couple of others. Right. So a couple of questions on chicken, which I'm going to take, and then probably I'm going to try and see if I can answer some from this, right? And then we'll do that. I think half of the questions are left, so we'll do that in the next week. So Priya0412 wants to check how to check if chicken is cooked or not without a thermometer. And she says she cooks chicken for her son, and she's largely clueless about how to do it safely and so on, right? And Trauma Queen 94 wants to know how to not dry out oven baked chicken. Sakshi Lalwani wants to know, is boiling chicken good before adding to gravy? Pranav Chaitanya wants to know how to keep chicken breast juicy. That's the easiest question. Pranav Chaitanya, in general, if you can avoid it, don't use chicken breast. It's the worst cut of meat in the planet. Actually, no, turkey is the worst, but chicken is the second worst cut of meat in the planet. Always go for boneless thighs if you want boneless. Much juicier, takes slightly longer to cook, does not lose as much moisture, much more tasty. Okay? So chicken breast is the worst thing ever, right? But if at all you do want to keep it juicy, you might want to soak chicken breast in about 8% salt. That's a liter of water and 80 grams of salt for about an hour, and then remove it, wash the external salt off, and then after that use that chicken in anything, and it will remain reasonably juicy because brining actually keeps chicken juicy and so on, right? So how to not dry oven baked chicken? Again, problem with chicken is if you use chicken breast, it will dry out. So first and foremost, use either with bone cuts or use chicken thighs, right? Our ovens are simply not hot enough, and so they need a longer time. And in that longer time, it's going to lose moisture. And so chicken ends up becoming dry no matter what you do in these ovens, right? Which is why a combination of brining using these kind of cuts generally works better. If you're up for it, I would suggest read my book, and there's a technique on how to do sous vide cooking, right? Without having a sous vide device, expensive sous vide device and so on. If you actually boil the chicken, to Sakshi Lalwani's question, to about a temperature of 67 or 69 Celsius, right? And you keep circulating the water, the temperature never rises above 69 Celsius, right? The chicken is going to be perfectly cooked through without losing moisture, right? And at that point, it loses moisture only when you cook it at higher temperatures. Then you can just grill it slightly on both sides to get browning, and that is the best possible way to eat chicken breast, actually, right? If at all you must. And then let's see. Paul Datta wants to know, why are butter and ghee conveniently accepted by all vegetarians? Well, Paul Datta, the history of vegetarianism in this part of the world, one, obviously it has a religious background in Jainism, Buddhism, ideas of ahimsa, which then became sort of like a more universal idea across a lot of the faiths within the subcontinent, right? That is one, right? But at the same time, when they said, fine, maybe we should not eat, things that move, things that have faces and eyes, that's largely the distinction that we tend to make, while conveniently ignoring that plants are also alive, right? So they realize that if they actually adopt what today we would call a vegan diet, back then, they would all be undernourished and basically not reproduce for us all to be alive, right? Because, back in those days, oat milk and avocados were not available. Okay? Almond milk and tempeh and soy was not really available in that sense, right? There was no way for them to make sure that they would get the right quality of protein from a purely plant-based diet. So obviously the exception was, fine, what can we add that is sort of fits into our moral universe of not harming an animal, and therefore dairy was chosen. So clearly it's, milk is something that all mammals drink, so it's logical that, we would just drink a cow's milk, and so on. So dairy and all dairy products became part of the extension of what would otherwise have been an impractical vegan lifestyle for that time. So that's why in India, which has the largest number of vegetarians in the world, has a lacto-vegetarian culture as opposed to a vegan culture. So that's why, right? Otherwise, we'd be short of proteins. We're still protein undernourished for the most part, at least in modern times, but that's a separate story, maybe for next week and so on. Okay. All right. I'm going to try and see if I can answer a couple of other questions. So, Vijita Valsala, lemon to make curd versus other curd culture. So, lemon is not making yogurt, is making curd. Yes, curd is essentially when milk proteins coagulate. Okay. So, the coagulation can happen two ways. Either you add the acid directly, that's like lemon, that is citric acid. It will cause the proteins to coagulate, and you'll get something resembling paneer. Okay, which then you drain the water, you get paneer, and so on. When you introduce bacteria, it's a more complex process. The bacteria eat the sugars in the milk, and then convert, and in that process convert it to lactic acid, and then the lactic acid then curdles the milk. So that is what is happening in yogurt, right? And because they eat the lactose, your yogurt ends up having less sugars and less carbohydrates as an end product. Adding lemon to yogurt is still going to keep the lactose in. It's going to curdle the protein directly. So it's not going to be as healthy as what would be bacterially fermented yogurt. So that would be the difference, right? All right. Again, a lot of questions about safety of oils, which I'm probably going to postpone to next week. All right, let's see. Yes, ginger garlic paste. Reduce its flavor to an extent, yes. So garlic particularly loses flavor very quickly. And so to retain its flavor in a ginger garlic paste that you buy from a store, they have to add preservatives. They usually add sodium citrate or citric acid of some kind. And that will essentially preserve it. But it will add sourness, right? So a lemony sourness, because again, citric acid, sodium citrate all taste like, lime, right? Because that's where citric acid comes from. So it is not going to have the fresh sort of smell that you get from garlic. But if you're in a hurry and if you're making one of those typical Punjabi gravies with 400 ingredients and ginger, onion, garlic, tomato, and everything else, honestly, it doesn't make a difference. But if you're making a dish where garlic plays a significant role in terms of its flavor, like say a lasuni dal or something, you might want to consider using fresh garlic. Right? Convenience, always use it when you're dunking 20,000 ingredients, but always, do that. So I think Kamya wanted to know what you can do with lichens. I'm assuming you're referring to the lichen that's called stone flour. Right? That's the only lichen I know that we use for cooking. Popular for some strange reason only in Maharashtra and southern Tamil Nadu. I don't know if I'm sure I'm being ignorant. There may be other parts of India that use stone flour, but these are the two that I'm aware of. I know, again, I think it's maybe used in avdi cooking as well. So anyway, so it has a smoky, musky flavor. So it's not something that you can detect right away, but in combination with other spices, it lends a sort of like a funky, smoky kind of a taste to dishes. And I think I've seen it being used in chettinad chicken curry. I think is one of the most common ways of using stone flour. And I think I believe it is part of Goda Masala, but I might be wrong. So, which is the Maharashtrian spice mix, sort of like a universal thing that you can absolutely use, right? All right. So somebody wants to know: is there a science behind comfort meals? So it's actually a good question. So a comfort meal is essentially a meal that hits as much of your food nostalgia memories as possible, evokes as much of your food nostalgia memories as possible, right? So if you've seen the movie Ratatouille, the larger message of that movie is that it's not the famousness of the chef or the hygiene or the fine dining, the ingredient, none of that actually matters, right? It's a rat. So the symbolism of the rat is that even a rat can be a fantastic chef if the chef understands that it's not about the technique of the cooking, but it's about whether the dish can evoke that person's nostalgia, right? And the combination of flavors that was chosen reminded him of the ratatouille clearly that he had as a child, fond memories that he had of his mother, and that is when he really gives a high rating to the restaurant and so on. And one of the subversive messages of ratatouille that most people don't understand, and I think you should internalize, is ignore all food reviews, right? Everybody writing food reviews, oh, that's a great restaurant, that's a fantastic, oh, this is overrated, that's a terrible food, oh, this is very nice. All food opinions can be safely ignored because they're all personal experiences. They are not generalizable in any sense. Of course, broadly, oh, it was too oily, it was too salty. To some degree, yeah, it was too greasy, etc., etc. But, come on, or portion sizes were too small and so on. But taste-wise, there are no ways for anyone to say that, oh, this was great. All they're saying is, when somebody says this is fantastic, what they're saying is, this was deeply familiar to me, right? Or it's novel enough for me based on my memories. Okay? And when they say, no, this was really overrated, all it means is that it didn't strike that person's nostalgia. It may very well do somebody else's. Right? And so therefore, the message of the movie Ratatouille is do not pay attention to food reviews. Do not pay attention to negative reviews of restaurants. Always read the earnest sounding positive ones, because there'll be a lot of fake positive reviews that people will write. But if you read carefully, you'll find that somebody genuinely probably wrote something. And that good experience, that's what you should read. Ignore all negative reviews on the internet in general. All right, and let me see. I think I have a couple of minutes, so here's what I'm going to do. So this was episode hydrogen. So next week will be episode helium. So I will get a clinical nutritionist next week to join me, and I will ask her all of the diet and nutrition related questions that you guys sent me that I did not get a chance to ask. I will try and hopefully, I have no idea whether any of these things, whether I can save these questions or not. But in any case, in general, if you feel that your question didn't get answered, please message me, DM me, and then I will add it to this list. And then we'll do another one that kind of addresses the remaining questions. I did not get a chance to go through about half of these questions. So that's the first of the Q&A series. In general, I think it's good for people to ask any kind of question. Don't feel afraid to ask questions, and more importantly, don't feel afraid to go mess up in the kitchen. Just long as you clean up and don't outsource that to someone else. Try things, right? And just apply some basic common sense around things that are too burnt, probably avoided. Things that smell funny are probably avoided. But apart from those basic things, everything else is really entirely up to you, right? On that note, I'm going to call it a day I'll call it a night for at least today. And we will see you next week, hopefully, if I can get the clinical nutritionist, and then we'll have another one to go through the rest of the questions. If any of you ask me questions that I did not answer, or you did not get an answer, I can see that a lot of the experts here have actually answered many of the questions. Send it to me on DM, then I will do it next week. And go forth and make delicious food. Bye-bye.